On va appeler le professeur Van Damme.
Let's now ask Professor Van Damme to come and take the floor. I think he's here. He's from Antwerp, Belgium. Thank you very much. He will be talking about vaccines, really his passion. And of course, we hope to hear about epidemiology of polio in the world. Thank you very much, and thanks to Robert for inviting me.
Because I went to school in Dutch, I was raised in French, donc vous pouvez poser vos questions en français.
So you can ask your questions in French.
Which is English, and so all the technical terms are very easy in English, but not evident in French. I even wouldn't know all the technical terms in French. So what I want to cover in the next 20 minutes is really the update on the epidemiology, but also talk about some innovations in vaccine. What is important in the story of polio, and of course you know this, is that we have to address 3 different strains. Now today with COVID-19 we all know how important strains are, variants, mutation. These are 3 different strains. They are not linked to each other. But also important is whenever we see a case somewhere in the world, we know there are at least more than 100 infections. So not all polio infections will cause a case. And that's something we need to understand in particular from a public health point of view, from an epidemiology point of view. The vaccines that were developed, and I know that my moderator wrote a book about the whole history of polio, and I received the book this morning, so I was very happy with that. Well, the vaccines that were developed, first of all in the 50s, the inactivated vaccine, are composed of these 3 different strains to have us making a defense, antibodies against, of course, each of these strains. Whether it is the inactivated vaccine or, and I try to get the next one, yes, this one. In the 60s, the oral attenuated polio vaccine, also that was originally composed of the 3 different strains. If we go back in history, we come from a very far situation where, as you can see, more than 350,000 cases per year were estimated. They were recorded, estimated. We know, of course, in low and middle income countries that the reporting system is not ideal, but these were just cases. So we had many, many more infections circulating at that moment on the globe. The next slide. I don't know whether I have to point to there or to there or to there, but yes, okay. And as you can see, a fantastic work has been achieved since the 80s up to, I would almost say, up to today. You see the number of cases decreasing over the years. And this is, of course, as a consequence of the use of the oral polio vaccine. Why? Because this is a very easy vaccine to administer. You just have to give 2 drops to any individual, a child or an adolescent or a adult, and it is cheap, and you don't need to be a nurse or a doctor to offer the vaccine. So from, again, a public health point of view, this is the most easy way to vaccinate someone in the world. Now, what do we know? This vaccine did a fantastic job, and as a consequence of the progress over the years, 2 types have been eradicated. So that means they are no longer circulating on the globe. The wild type 2 in 1999 and wild type 3 in 2015. And you see also that the World Health Organization takes a number of years before really declaring the eradication, 2015 and 2019 respectively. For the moment, the only type that is circulating as a wild type is type 1 in 2 countries, Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now, what is the consequence of using a vaccine that is oral and live attenuated? If you swallow that vaccine, the vaccine virus that is live attenuated ends up in your stools. And the stools can end up in the environment, and then it can start still survive, mutate, and circulate. So there is a risk of what we call vaccine-associated polio paralysis, which will occur very soon after immunization, very often after 7 to 10 days. But there is a second risk, is what we call the circulating vaccine-derived polio viruses. Here you see the definition of what is a circulating vaccine-derived polio. In fact, it is that attenuated strain that ends up in the environment and that can infect, at that point, unvaccinated children very often. And there, in the gut of the children, that virus vaccine will continue to mutate and, of course, can become more and more potent again. And then at the end, can also cause paralysis. So what do we have to do? First of all, we know that most of these circulating vaccine-derived polio virus cases are type 2 cases. So they are no longer linked to the wild type, they are linked to that oral vaccine. This is one of the reasons why increasingly, all over the world, countries start to use more and more the inactivated polio vaccine. Of course, you need an injection, it is more expensive, and you need a nurse or a doctor to administer the vaccine. So it is not evident for a large number of low and middle income countries to do the step from oral vaccine to inactivated vaccine. Second thing is we try to use less oral polio type 2 vaccine in the current vaccines, and I come back to that. But the most important thing is put here on bold is we need to raise the background immunity among young infants, among children, among school children all over the world. And that is still the first thing to be done. You can develop new vaccines. This has no sense as long as we don't increase the coverage of the background immunity. And of course, we need better oral vaccine because, of course, an oral vaccine is cheap and easy to administer. So these are some important conditions. You have seen this graph perhaps before. It gives a history of many activities, but I just highlight the last one, is the shift that occurred in 2016 from the use of a OPV1, 2, 3 vaccine to only a bivalent vaccine, OPV1 and 3. So overall in the world, type 2 has been taken out of the vaccine to decrease the risk of using of seeing these circulating vaccine-derived polio virus cases. Now, strange enough, we start more and more, this is a slide from 2020, we start more and more to control those wild-type cases, and you see indeed on the orange line that the number of wild-type cases is clearly decreasing. But if you look at the circulating vaccine-derived polio cases, and I see people take pictures, but the slides will be available. I can give them to Robert, so no problem. You can have the slides. But what we see is that those circulating vaccine-derived cases, they are increasing. And at the end, we have more circulating vaccine-derived cases than wild-type cases. That was one of the reasons that the World Health Assembly said polio is still, as you can see, an international health regulation and, of course, a public health emergency of international concern. We know this. COVID-19 was exactly the same, monkeypox or mpox also, but you see, even before, in 2019, it was confirmed that polio remains a very high, important thing on the agenda of the World Health Assembly. What was the consequence of COVID-19? Well, of course, in many low and middle income countries, the overall coverage of infant vaccination went down, unfortunately. It has to do with manpower, with budgets, with the consequences of COVID-19. Parents can have no access anymore to the immunization centers. And the number of children that receive no vaccine at all has been increasing, unfortunately, as a consequence of COVID-19. We talk now about what we call zero-dose children. And this is, of course, tremendously challenging for the future. So this needs to be catched up as soon as possible in all these countries. Where are we today? This is a slide, as you can see, that I downloaded this morning. That's the advantage of PowerPoint on a stick. This morning I looked at the website of the Global Polio Eradication Initiative. You see the wild-type cases, Afghanistan, Pakistan, from the beginning of the year up to now. It is well controlled, it is not zero, but they do a tremendous effort to keep the number of wild-type cases, type 1, very low. And of course, we hope that this quickly goes to zero. I have to move on quickly now. What is the most important challenge? As you can see on this graph, also a graph I downloaded this morning, the red spots are the wild-type cases, and there are a few red spots in Africa, but these are imported red spots, not endemic. It is only endemic in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, as you can see, the yellow countries. But then you have all these green spots. The green spots shows clearly that there is an issue with the circulating vaccine-derived polio type 2. The green are the 2 types, the brown are the 1 types. Now, some people will challenge me and say, oh, why did we use that oral polio vaccine in the past? Well, this slide shows you if we wouldn't have done so, we would have be responsible for a large number of polio cases. So that oral vaccine has done a fantastic job. And the most recent data shows that in the absence of using that vaccine, more than 6.5 million children would have been paralyzed worldwide. So the vaccine did really a great job. Now we have to limit the harm and, of course, to use innovation. Innovation, I refer quickly to, because I have 5 minutes, to new vaccines that have been developed, and we have been helping the consortium to assess the vaccine. Of course, these were new vaccines, oral vaccines, attenuated strain 2 vaccines based on the earlier one. But of course, what did we have to show? That it has a lower likelihood to mutate and of course to cause sooner or later against, again, potent strains. We had to do that in a very particular situation. I will move on. We built a container village in Antwerp because we didn't know if that virus vaccine would escape and enter into the environment, whether that was safe, yes or no. So the heroes of this story are the volunteers, because they stayed for 28 days in a container unit. They couldn't leave. Every day we took blood, we took samples of their nose and throat, and of course we looked at their stools to see whether the virus in the vaccine was stable, yes or no. So you can see that was quite an important experience for us, but of course also for the volunteers. I tried to move on. We called that Poliopolis. Very, very obvious. I try to get the next one if possible. The remote control is not listening well to me. Can I have the next one, please? Yes. You see the big containers outside. It's really to collect all the water, shower water, toilet water, and what is needed, of course, to avoid contamination of the environment. I will not intend into all the details, but what we saw is that this vaccine, or at least what the Schett virus refers to, has no meaningful increase in neurovirulence. So it is more stable than what we were using in the past. I move on now, because in the meantime, the vaccine that was assessed in Antwerp and in Panama, because we also worked with them, is used in more than 28 countries at this moment, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, and more than 600 million doses are being used at this moment. So that is important to know, that the evolution has been very quick. Other vaccines are being developed. I will not enter into the details, but also we try to make inactivated vaccines more potent and stronger. But what is also interesting is very recently also a novel OPV1 and a novel OPV3 vaccine are being developed just for the same reason, to have safer oral vaccines that cannot no longer mutate. Now recently, and I know someone in the audience was asking the question yesterday, we saw already some circulating vaccine-derived polio cases in London, in New York, and in Jerusalem, and this seemed to be related to each other. And the bottom line of the whole story, and to make a long story short, is that each time we see that in a very little part of, for instance, a city like London, in a suburb or in schools, the background immunity is low. That's the general denominator. Whether it is in London, whether it is in New York, each time we see that a certain proportion of the children, school children, have a too low immunization coverage. This is the ideal situation for having these circulating vaccine-derived polio infecting these children and creating, of course, little outbreaks. So we have first at all to increase the background immunity. That's what I want to say. Polio is no longer, you don't have to think it is not discussed. It has been discussed at the G7 last week in Japan, also at the World Assembly this week in Geneva. So it is still very high on the agenda because definitely we want to eradicate this disease by preventing cases, by interrupting transmission, and finally by eradicating the polio of the globe. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Van Damme. It's very interesting. There are some questions. Just one question. We were a bit concerned last year with the 3 cases of poliomyelitis in New York, London, and Tel Aviv. Can you tell us what we know about the circulation of the virus derived from the vaccine in New York, London, and why not in Paris?
Well, first of all, the way to know this is to control the wastewater. And so in London, in New York, and now in an increasing number of large cities, they look at the wastewater, and in the wastewater they look for the poliovirus. You don't see any cases, but you see circulation of the poliovirus, but it is then the vaccine-related poliovirus. So that comes very often through, of course, asylum seekers, refugees, who have been vaccinated in a country like Afghanistan or in Pakistan with the oral polio vaccine, and they come here and they are still shedding. And of course, that enters into the wastewater, that enters into the circulation, into some communities. And if the communities have no good background immunity, it starts to infect people. That's what we know. And then, of course, from one community in London, people start to travel to Tel Aviv, to Jerusalem, to New York, and it's there. So what do we have to do? Increase the background immunity as soon as possible. Lower the threshold for these people to be vaccinated. So if we have asylum seekers entering, but also some communities, and we do that for Roma communities, for Jewish communities, because they are not against immunization. They have a difficult access to immunization programs. So we have to help them to get the vaccine.
Merci. Thank you very much.
So, thank you very much. I have a question. If you look at the WHO statistics, what is very surprising is that the timing of vaccination and number of doses are very different in each country. I'm not speaking about mandatory and voluntary vaccination. Does it mean that there is missing any scientific background for vaccination, or it doesn't matter?
In fact, it doesn't matter. That's what we learned. So it is historically. And we have many different schedules that do work. We have an increasing number of countries that start with oral polio vaccine and that continues with the inactivated polio vaccine. You have others who only use inactivated polio vaccine. In fact, all these schedules do work as long as we reach everyone. And you can have some more weeks or months between 2 or 3 doses. Doesn't matter. You need a certain critical number of doses to really have a good basic immunity. But that can be done through different mechanisms. Timing is not important, but you have to start soon, of course, to avoid a growing vulnerable population of young infants.
Est-ce que vous pensez que
Do you think that in Europe this could come back? Because I know many adult people who don't get vaccinated at all anymore. So it's only children because it is mandatory. But children are not getting vaccinated for many years now. So isn't that a risk that this disease comes back? So what matters is that we stay above a certain level of background immunity. If we are above 80%, that's defendable. And what we see is that in small community, it falls below this threshold, so there's a risk. Very often, adults have been vaccinated in the past, so that's not an issue. If they don't travel, that's okay. So the recommendation is if you travel to a country like Afghanistan, Pakistan, you need a booster. So that's the general recommendation, not only in Europe, but globally. And that's a way to limit the circulation. But I think that what matters the most is to vaccinate children who are still vulnerable. And this is where the virus from the vaccine or the white virus will try to get access to vulnerable populations. Thank you very much, Professor Van Damme.